The cold came early to the Appalachian Ridge that year. By the middle of November, the black pines were already bowed under the weight
This
of
is my
snow,
land.
and the
Not
creek
for
behind
long,
the
mortal.
cabin had narrowed
We'll
to a
see
thin
about
silver
that.
thread, barely moving beneath a skin of ice. The sky for 3 days running had been the color of old pewter, low and close, the kind of sky that presses down on a man's shoulders and reminds him that winter in these mountains is not a season. It is a presence. It has intentions. Colt Hargrove had learned to read that sky the way some men read scripture, not for comfort, for truth. He was 24 years old, though most mornings he felt closer to 40. He had lived alone at the foot of Grayback Ridge for 3 years now, in a cabin he had built mostly by himself against the eastern face of the rock wall, where the stone gave natural shelter from the worst of the westerly winds. The cabin was small. One main room with a stone hearth, a narrow bed frame against the far wall, a single chair, shelves he had cut and fitted himself from green timber that had since gone golden with age, a woodshed attached at the north end, a porch wide enough for 2 people, though it had never held more than one. He had chosen this place deliberately, not because it was beautiful, though it was, not because the hunting was good, though it was that too. He had chosen it because it was far from the trade roads, far from the garrison towns, far from the sound of men making decisions that got other men killed. He had been a border patrol soldier once for just over 2 years. He did not speak of it. What he carried from that time lived not in words but in the body, in the way he still slept facing the door, in the way his hand moved to his belt before his mind caught up, in the way certain sounds at night could pull him upright out of a dead sleep, with his pulse hammering and nothing but darkness around him. He had come to the mountains to be quiet. Most days the mountain cooperated. That afternoon he was splitting wood in the yard, the axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm, the sound of each split log clean and satisfying in the frozen air. He had already stacked 3 cords against the cabin wall and wanted one more before the storm broke. The sky had darkened to charcoal by mid-afternoon. He could smell the snow coming, a cold mineral smell, almost like iron, and he wanted to be inside with the fire banked high before the first flakes fell. He worked without thinking much. That was the gift of this kind of labor. It asked everything of the body and nothing of the mind, and the mind, left to itself in the silence, eventually went quiet too. He had learned that silence was not emptiness. It was something you could build a life inside of, carefully if you were patient enough. He did not notice her until the axe was already coming down on the next log. There was a sound that did not belong, not the hiss of wind through pine needles, not the soft percussion of snow falling from a heavy branch. Something uneven, something dragging. He let the axe follow through, buried it in the chopping block, and turned. A shape was moving through the trees at the far edge of the yard, moving wrong, lurching. Each step forward looked like a negotiation with gravity, as if the body had to argue with itself to keep going. He stood absolutely still and watched. She came out of the tree line and into the pale, open light of the yard, and his first coherent thought was that she was going to fall before she reached him. She was an orc woman, tall, nearly as tall as he was, but the first thing that struck him was not her height. It was how thin she was. He could see the angles of her collarbones above the neckline of what she was wearing, which was not a coat, not a traveling cloak, not anything suited for weather like this. She wore the ruins of a ceremonial dress. The fabric had been red and black once, stitched with bone beads and fine silver thread in patterns he didn't recognize. Now it was torn at the hem and the left shoulder, the fabric stiff with ice where the snow had melted into it and refrozen. Her feet were bare. He registered that last, and it was the detail that landed hardest. Bare feet in 1.5 feet of snow, the skin gone from green to a gray so pale it was almost white. Her hair was black and had been braided once, thick formal braids that spoke of ceremony and status. Now they hung in frozen ropes across her face, swinging with each staggering step. Her amber eyes were open and fixed on him. She made it to within 10 feet of him before her knees gave. She did not fall all the way. One hand shot out and caught the edge of the chopping block, and she held herself half upright, head bowed, breathing in the desperate, shallow way of someone who has been breathing like that for a very long time. His first instinct, the one that lived below thought, was to scan the tree line. He did it without deciding to. He looked left, then right, then back to the pines she had emerged from. He looked for movement, for shapes, for the telltale darkness of a figure standing still among the trees. Because orc women did not appear alone and barefoot in killing storms by accident. Because the wars had taught him that desperation could be manufactured, that a single figure stumbling into a yard could be a door held open for something worse behind it. He saw nothing, only the pines and the snow beginning to fall in earnest now, fat, soft flakes drifting down without sound. He looked back at her. She had raised her head. Her eyes were on him, and what he saw in those amber eyes was not the flat calculation of someone running a lure. It was the raw animal exhaustion of a living thing that has been running for so long, it no longer remembers why it started. Fear, yes, but underneath the fear, something quieter and more final. The stillness of a person who has made their peace and is waiting to see how the world answers. She was not acting. No one alive was that good. She drew one more breath, ragged and wet, and said two words, "Please, inside." He moved. He pulled the axe from the block, not for her, just habit, just the weight of it in his hand, and crossed the yard in a dozen long strides and crouched in front of her. Up close, the damage was worse. Her lips were cracked and bleeding in two places. The skin of her hands, where they gripped the chopping block, had gone white at the knuckles and gray at the fingertips. Her feet he did not look at again. Not yet. "Can you walk?" he asked. She shook her head. Small movement, barely there. He made the choice without deliberating. He put the axe down in the snow, worked one arm under her knees and the other behind her shoulders, and stood. She was lighter than she should have been. That was the detail that stayed with him. A woman her height should have had more weight to her. The lightness was its own story, and it was not a good one. He carried her up the porch steps and kicked the cabin door open and brought her inside. The heat of the room came at them both. He had left the fire burning high before he went out to split wood, and the cabin was warm in the way that only a well-built stone hearth can make a room warm, deeply, steadily, with no cold corners. He crossed to the hearth and lowered her onto the thick braided rug in front of it, close enough to feel the fire's reach, but far enough not to burn. He got every blanket he owned, 3 wool blankets from the bed, a heavy fur from the chest by the wall, a quilted layer he had bought from a trader 2 winters ago and never used. He wrapped them around her in order, starting with her feet, working up. When he touched her feet, he made himself slow down and look. The toes were white, not gray, not black, white and stiff. Frostbite was a negotiation, and he had caught this one before it finished the argument. He put water on to heat, salt from the shelf, honey from the crock by the window. When the water was warm, not hot, warm, the way a healer had once shown him, he poured it into a tin cup and knelt beside her and lifted her head with one hand. "Drink," he said, slowly, small sips. She drank. Her throat worked convulsively on the first sip, then steadied. He fed the whole cup to her over 10 minutes, refilled it, let her have half of that. Then he sat back on his heels and added 3 logs to the fire and watched the flames rise. Outside, the storm arrived fully. The wind came first, pushing against the walls in long, steady pressure, and then the snow began to fall in curtains, visible through the small window as a soft, pale blankness that swallowed the yard, the tree line, the mountains, everything. Inside, the only sounds were the fire and the slow, steadying rhythm of her breathing. He sat in the chair across the room and watched her. After a long time, she spoke. Her voice was rough at the edges, scraped raw by cold and disuse, but the word was clear. Mara. He took a moment to understand she was giving him her name. Then he answered, "Colt." She turned her head slightly and looked at the room. The stone hearth, the rough-cut walls with their pegs and shelves, the single window, the narrow bed, the chair he was sitting in. She took it all in with the eyes of someone cataloging rather than judging. Then she looked at him. He could not read everything in her expression, but he could read enough. There was wariness still, deeply set, the kind that does not go away in a single warm room. There was exhaustion so complete it had moved past feeling into something almost like calm. And underneath both of those things, small and careful as a flame in wind, there was something that might have been relief. Not the relief of comfort, the relief of having made the right call. "Stay until the storm passes," he said. Then we'll decide what comes next." She did not answer, her eyes closed. Within a few minutes, her breathing deepened and evened out into the long, slow rhythm of someone who has finally put down a weight they have been carrying for too long. He stayed in the chair. The fire crackled. The storm pressed at the walls. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose, and watched the room and thought about the deer path at the far edge of the yard, which was the only way through the ridge from the east, and thought about the tree line, and thought about what it meant that she had arrived exactly when she did. He sat with all of it and let the long night begin. The storm held for 3 full days. On the first morning, she ran a fever. Not high enough to kill, but high enough to pull her in and out of consciousness, her body working through the shock of what it had survived. He kept the fire built up and the blankets layered, and gave her warm water whenever she surfaced enough to swallow. He heated a cloth and worked on her feet again, slowly warming the tissue back towards something functional, watching the color return degree by degree. The process made her flinch even in her half-sleep, a small involuntary tightening of the jaw. He kept going. Pain meant circulation. Circulation meant she was going to keep those feet. By the second morning, the fever had broken and she was sleeping true, deep and still. He moved more freely around the cabin, cooking a thin venison stew, checking the door braces against the wind pressure, doing the small maintenance tasks a cabin in a storm requires. Once he came back inside from securing the woodshed door, to find her watching him from the rug. Eyes open, tracking. The fever was gone and the awareness was back. He poured broth into the cup and brought it to her. She tried to sit up on her own, made it halfway. He crouched and put an arm behind her back without asking, and she let him, which told him something about how much strength she still did not have. He held the cup. She took it from his hand, held it herself, drank. "You don't need to do that," she said. Her voice was still rough but clearer now. She meant the cup, the helping. "I know," he answered and went back to the stew. He heard her exhale behind him. Not quite a laugh, something in that general direction. On the third day, she sat up on her own and kept sitting up. She watched him mend a torn pack strap for the better part of an hour without speaking. Then she pushed herself to standing, one hand on the wall, and walked slowly to the shelf where he kept the dried herbs and studied them with the focused attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. She rearranged 3 bundles without asking, moving them to a different section of the shelf. He said nothing, only added wood to the fire and watched her work. That evening, the wind dropped by half and the snowfall thinned to a slow, steady drift. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, him in the chair and her on the rug with the blankets around her shoulders. The silence between them had changed over the 3 days. At the beginning, it had been the silence of 2 strangers in an enclosed space, careful and slightly tense. Now it was something else. Not comfortable exactly, but no longer strained. She spoke first. "I was not lost," she said. "I want you to understand that." He set down the whetstone he had been using on his knife and waited. Mara pulled the blanket tighter across her shoulders. The firelight caught the amber of her eyes and the strong planes of her face. She had a quality when she was about to say something difficult, a stillness, a slight squaring of the tupum, as if she were choosing each word the way you choose footing on ice. "My name is Mara Stonetusk," she said. "Not just Mara. That is my full name, and I want you to have it." He nodded. "I was the ceremonial wife of the old chieftain of the Stonetusk clan." She said it the way someone reads from a document. Flat, precise, not a binding I chose. A political arrangement made when I was 19. I was given no option to refuse. She paused. "In my clan, a political wife has one primary obligation. She is expected to produce an heir within 4 winters." The chieftain was not a young man. The fire crackled between them. 4 winters came and went, Mara continued. No child. The council met. She gave a short, dry sound that was not quite a laugh. "Problems need an owner. I was available. So they named me the problem. Called me barren. Called me a curse on the bloodline. Said I was drawing ill fortune to the clan." She looked at her hands. They said it in front of everyone. Every man and woman and child in the hall. They made it a public recitation. My name, my failure, the sentence. "What was the sentence?" he asked. She looked up. "They stripped me of rank and name inside the clan. Took my weapons, took my winter cloak, Took everything but this dress. She glanced down at the ruined ceremonial garment. Then they walked me to the gates and opened them. In the deep cold, barefoot, the chieftain himself said it was a sacrifice to the season, a clean death, no blood on the hands of the clan. The snow would do what needed doing. She said all of this without her voice breaking, not because she did not feel it. He could see that she felt it in the way her hands gripped the edge of the blanket. It was because she had already done whatever breaking she was going to do before she arrived at his door. What remained was the structure after the collapse, the bones of a person who had decided to stay standing. I walked for 3 days, she said. I knew these mountains a little, enough to keep moving, to find what shelter the rock faces give. The snow took my footprints behind me. I thought I would die somewhere quiet, a hollow in the rock, a place where the wind didn't reach. She stopped. Her jaw tightened for a moment, then released. Then I saw the smoke, she said. From your chimney. He looked at her steadily. I watched from the trees for most of a day before I came forward, she said. I want you to understand that too. I watched how you moved, how you worked, the way you carried yourself when you thought no one was watching. She met his eyes. A man alone in the mountains for 3 years carries himself a certain way. He is either waiting for something to be afraid of, or he has made his peace with the quiet. You moved like the second kind, so you decided to risk it, he said. She shook her head slightly. I was past risk at that point. I was deciding whether to die in the snow or to ask a stranger for help and see what happened. She held his gaze. You were the only variable that mattered. The log in the hearth shifted and settled, throwing a brief, bright scatter of sparks up the flue. Then something shifted in her face. A different kind of effort. Whatever she was about to say next was harder than the rest. There is something else, she said, something I have told no one outside the clan. Before my binding to the chieftain. When I was young, I loved a warrior in secret, a young man of the clan. We were never permitted. The match was not politically useful. But we were young, and we were foolish, and we were in love the way people sometimes are when they have no idea what the world costs. He set the whetstone down on the floor beside the chair. I became pregnant, she said. Her voice was steady but very quiet. We hid it as long as we could. When it became impossible to hide, I lost the child. Very early, before it had a chance. She looked at the fire. It happens sometimes. There is no blame in it, no cruelty intended by the body. It simply happens. She stopped, and when she continued, her voice had taken on a different quality, sharper, more deliberate. The chieftain knew about this. His council had investigated me before the binding. They knew my history in full. He kept his face still, and when the 4 winters passed and I was named Baron and brought before the hall, she said, the chieftain stood there and let it happen. He let his council call me cursed and broken, let them assign the failure to me when he knew. He knew what he knew about himself. He had always known. Before the binding, before the ceremony, before the first winter was over, she looked up from the fire and looked at him directly. His seed had been dead long before my history. She said it plainly, without heat, without drama. There was never going to be a child, not with him, not with any woman. The council may have suspected it. The chieftain certainly knew it. And rather than face that truth in front of his clan, rather than stand in the hall himself and speak it, he needed someone to carry the failure. He looked at my history and he saw the shape of a story that would serve his purposes. And I had no power to tell a different one. The fire burned between them. The wind outside had dropped to almost nothing. The snow fell in silence beyond the window. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. You don't owe me anything for keeping you alive, he said. Not a story, not an explanation, nothing. She shook her head slightly. I'm not telling you because I owe you. I'm telling you because you asked me to stay, and I wanted to stay, and I don't begin things with half a truth. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her his piece. Not all of it. He had never told all of it to anyone and did not expect to begin tonight. But enough. I lost my parents young, he said. Mother to a fever when I was 9, father to a raid 2 years later. After that, I was raised by whoever would have me, which was never quite the same as being raised by someone who wanted to. He looked at the fire. When I was old enough, I joined the Border Patrol. I thought if I could be useful enough, it would fill the space. He stopped. It didn't. I saw things I don't have words for. I made decisions that still wake me up at night. And then one winter, I stopped making decisions altogether and came here instead. He looked up at her. I didn't expect to stay this long, he said. I keep staying because nothing out there has made a better case. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, we both know what it is to be left to manage alone. It was not a dramatic statement. She said it the way you say something true. He received it the same way. After that, the fire burned lower, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and it was not uncomfortable. He picked the whetstone back up and resumed his work. She watched the flames with her chin resting on her folded knees, thinking whatever she was thinking, and the cabin held them both in its warmth without asking anything of either of them. The next morning, the storm had broken. The sky was a cold, clear blue, and the snow in the yard lay undisturbed and white and deep. The mountain world remade in silence. Colt was outside before full light, checking the woodshed, reading the state of the paths. When he came inside, Mara was sitting up, the blankets across her shoulders, watching the window. He said, I'm going to start building a room. On the north side against the rock. More protected. She looked at him. I told you to stay until the storm passed, he said. Then we decide what comes next, he shrugged. I've decided. You need somewhere that's yours. I have the timber. The work isn't complicated. It'll take a week, maybe less, depending on the weather. She said nothing for a moment. Then, you don't know anything about me. I know enough, he answered. You'll tell me the rest when you want to. In my clan, she said, shelter is given by blood or earned by combat. There is no other way. He went to the peg by the door and took down his coat. Then consider this a different kind of arrangement, he said, and went outside. After a few minutes, she heard the sound of timber being dragged across the frozen yard. She was on her feet and out the door by the second load, still moving with a limp that favored the right foot, but moving without asking for help. She took the far end of the first beam when he lifted it. He did not comment. They worked in the rhythm that labor finds when two people are paying attention. Lift, align, hold, and the frame of the room went up in the pale cold light of the first clear day after the storm. That afternoon, when they came inside and she was warming her hands by the fire, she turned to him. The afternoon light came through the small window at a low angle and caught her face clearly. The hollow below her cheekbones that the days of broth and warmth had not yet filled. The amber eyes, alert and watchful, carrying something that had not been there 3 days ago. Not relief anymore. Something that was thinking about the future. Let me stay, she said. Her voice was quiet but completely steady. I'll be your wife. It was not a plea. It was not a trade. It was the same quality of deliberate choice she had exercised at the edge of the tree line when she had spent a day watching him before she decided to trust. The decision made. The words as plain and irrevocable as the iron ring of a door latch. Not because I need shelter, she continued. I have survived things shelter does not fix. Not because I owe you, I told you that already. She held his gaze. Because I have had almost nothing in my life that I chose freely. And I am choosing this. I am choosing you. He stood across the room from her for a long moment. Long enough that the fire shifted and the light in the room changed slightly. Then he crossed it, and he answered. That night the fire burned long and low, and the wind was nothing but a whisper in the pines. And inside the cabin, the silence had changed again. It had become the silence of two people who have put something into the world together and are now simply living in the space it makes. He sat in the chair, and she sat on the rug, and the distance between them was less than it had been. The cabin was the same four walls, the same stone hearth, the same rough-cut timber. But the shape of the life inside it was no longer the shape of one person's solitude. Something new was taking up residence. Small, careful, improbable. The way a fire is when it first catches, before it becomes the kind of thing you can rely on, but clearly intending to get there. Outside, the Appalachian winter lay clean and white and perfectly still under a sky full of stars. The black pines stood in their rows along the ridge. The creek breathed beneath its ice. And in the cabin at the foot of Grayback Ridge, for the first time and longer than either of them could easily remember, two people slept in the same warmth, and the dark was not something to be survived. It was simply the night, and the night was ordinary, and ordinary was everything. The new room went up in 6 days. Colt had built the main cabin alone, 3 years ago, working through an autumn that kept threatening to turn and never quite did. He had learned things in that process. What green timber does when it dries wrong, how to seat a corner joint so it doesn't separate in the cold, how to read the rock face for the best anchor points. He worked faster now, with the knowledge of someone who had made the mistakes already. And this time he did not work alone. Mara held the beams while he drilled and pegged them. She passed nails before he asked. She watched the first joint go in and said nothing. But on the second, she adjusted the angle of the beam by half an inch without being told. And when he looked at her, she just looked back. Steady, and he nodded and drove the peg, and it was the truest joint he had set in years. She moved with a limp still, the right foot favoring itself when she was tired, though she would not admit to tired. He had stopped offering to take the heavier end of things. She had made her position on that clear enough in the first 2 days. "I am not glass." She had said it once, quietly, without emphasis, and it had closed the subject entirely. By the end of the 5th day, the walls were up and chinked. By the end of the 6th, the roof was on, low and tight, built into the overhang of the rock face so the mountain itself formed the northern wall. He cut a small window on the eastern side, facing the ridge, so the room would catch the first light. He fitted it with a shutter of split pine, hung on leather hinges, that opened outward and latched against the rock. When it was finished, she stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long time without speaking. It was small, smaller than the main room, but it had the quality that a well-built shelter in a hard climate always has, a sense of intention, of things placed with care, of resistance to the world outside made permanent and solid. The walls didn't breathe. The corners were true. The floor, packed earth covered with flat stones he had pulled from the creek, was level. "You built this in 6 days," she said. He was behind her in the yard, cleaning the drill on a rag. "It's not finished," he said. "Needs a bed frame, some shelving. The shutter wants another layer on the inside against the deep cold." She turned around and looked at him with an expression he was still learning to read. Something in it that was not quite wonder. She was too careful for wonder, but was in the same territory. Something that recognized an unexpected thing and was deciding what to do with it. "Thank you," she said. He went to put the tools away. That was the end of the 6th day, and in the weeks that followed, the rhythm of the cabin changed in the slow, unremarked way that the rhythm of any shared life changes, gradually and then all at once, and then you can no longer remember the previous arrangement. She slept in the new room, he slept in the main room. They met at the fire in the mornings and worked alongside each other through the days and sat on opposite sides of the hearth in the evenings. The silences were easy. The conversation, when it came naturally. She knew things he didn't. How to set a snare for small game in a way that left no human scent on the trigger. How to read the behavior of the pines for incoming weather. How to render tallow cleanly so it burned without smoking. He knew things she didn't. The particular geography of this ridge, the way the creek ran in thaw, where the black bears denned, and which trails to avoid in certain seasons. They traded this knowledge back and forth across the days like any two practical people sharing a space. And the trading built something between them, the way physical labor builds muscle, quietly, below the level of notice, until one day the thing is simply there. January turned to February without ceremony. The deep cold settled in the way it does in the high Appalachian, not dramatically but absolutely, establishing itself as the single governing fact of the world. The creek froze solid now, and he had to break ice to get water in the mornings. The pines groaned at night under the weight of accumulated snow. The sky for days at a time was a seamless gray, low and still, the kind of sky that makes you feel the mountains around you as shelter rather than obstacle. Inside the cabin, the fire never went out. One morning in the middle of February, he came in from checking the trap line, a long loop through the eastern woods, 2 hours out and back, and she was standing at the table with her back to him. She had been sorting dried herbs, a habit she had developed in the last few weeks, organizing what he had and labeling the bundles in her careful handwriting on small strips of bark. But she had stopped sorting. She was standing perfectly still, with one hand resting low on her abdomen, fingers spread slightly, the way a person rests a hand on a surface they are listening through. He set the pack down quietly and stood for a moment. Then he took off his coat and hung it on the peg and went to check on the fire. He added a log and said nothing. He saw it again 3 days later and said nothing that time either. Some things announced themselves in their own time. On a gray afternoon in the third week of February, she came in from outside and stood by the fire, warming her hands. He was at the table carving a new draw knife handle. She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she said, "I have not had my blood in 2 months." He set the knife down. She turned and looked at him then. Her face was entirely composed. Not the composure of someone suppressing feeling, but the composure of someone who has had several days to sit with a fact and has arrived at a particular relationship with it. "I have been trying to understand it," she said, "what they told me, what the chieftain's people said about me." She paused. "I spent 4 years believing the story they built, that my body was the failure, that the fault lived in me." She looked at her hands. "I know now that was not true. I think I knew it then. But knowing and believing are different things when everyone around you is insisting on the lie." He stood up from the table and crossed the room. He stood in front of her, close, and looked at her face. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about this seriously, as she thought about everything. "Alive," she answered. "Scared, but mostly real. Like something that was told it didn't exist is finding out that it does." He reached out slowly and she did not pull back. He placed his hand over hers where it rested low on her abdomen. Through the layers of her clothing, he could feel the warmth of her body, the steady movement of her breathing. They stood like that for a moment. "We'll make room," he said. "Whatever the child needs, we'll build it." She looked at him with those amber eyes that carried everything she was thinking without quite saying all of it. "You're already planning," she said. He was. He had been since the morning he'd watched her hand against her belly at the table, calculating without deciding to. Where a cradle would fit in the new room, what kind of wood would be best, how to seal the floor stones against drafts, how much more firewood he would need to keep both rooms warm through a full winter with a newborn in the house. The calculations had been running in the background of everything else, quiet and persistent, the way water finds a path downhill. He went out the next morning and began selecting timber from the pile. Not the rough-cut structural stock, but the seasoned pine boards he had been saving, tightly grained and straight, the kind of wood that comes out smooth under a plane. He brought 6 boards inside and began working them at the table in the evenings, a few inches at a time, patient with the grain. Mara watched this without comment, but sometimes when he was working on something else, he would turn and find her sitting beside the unfinished cradle, one hand trailing along the planed edge of the side rail, her face carrying something private that she did not say aloud. He would turn back to whatever he was doing and give her the privacy of the moment. February ended. March arrived with a brief false thaw, 3 days of softer air and dripping eaves and the sound of water moving under the creek ice, and then folded back into cold, as March in the high mountains nearly always does. But the light had changed. The days were marginally longer. The angle of the sun through the eastern window of the new room hit the floor in the mid-afternoon in a way it had not done in months, and the quality of that light was different, carrying some promise of what was coming that the winter light had lacked. On a morning of iron-gray sky and still air, Mara went outside before he was fully awake. He heard the door of the new room open and close, and her footsteps on the porch, and then nothing. He lay for a moment and listened to the silence, and then got up and put the kettle on the fire and went to the window. She was standing in the yard looking at the snow, not at anything specific, not at the tree line or the trail or the sky, at the snow directly in front of her, in the yard between the cabin and the woodshed. He pulled on his coat and went outside. She heard him come down the porch steps but did not look up. He came up beside her and looked at what she was looking at. In the fresh snow between the woodshed and the north wall of the cabin there were tracks. Large, wider than his boot at the toe, and the depth was significant. Whoever had made them was heavy, carrying weight. 4 prints, all told. Approaching from the east side of the cabin, stopping just short of the woodshed wall, then turning and going back the way they came. They were not his tracks. The night's new snow had half filled them, which put them at somewhere between 6 and 10 hours old. Made in the dark, made by someone who had stood in the shadow of the woodshed and looked at the cabin and then left without making a sound. He studied them for a moment. The print shape was familiar in a specific way. Not the rounded toe of a man's boot, a slightly different spread at the toe, a slightly different weight distribution at the heel. He had seen this shape before, in other contexts, in the years when his work had required him to know the difference. Orc, he said quietly. She nodded once. She had already known. He looked at her. She was looking at the tracks with an expression he could not fully interpret, something that had layers in it. Not surprise, which confirmed that she had been prepared for this, that some part of her had been waiting. And beneath the absence of surprise, something more complex, the face of a person running a calculation they had hoped not to have to run. He waited for her to speak. She said, "The fire should be ready by now." She turned and went back inside. He stood in the yard for another moment, looking at the tracks. Then he walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly, reading the snow. There were no other prints. One set in, one set out. Whoever it was had come to look and had gone. He found the point where the trail emerged from the eastern tree line. A single figure, traveling alone, coming from the direction of the High Ridge Road. He went back inside. She had the kettle off the fire and the cups on the table, and she was standing with her back to the room, looking at the window. He came in and closed the door and sat down at the table. He said, "You know who came?" A pause, then, "I know the kind of person who came." He poured his own cup and sat back. She turned around and sat across from him. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the steam rising from it. "The Stone Tusk clan does not leave things unfinished," she said. "An exile is a statement. A statement requires confirmation. Someone would come to establish that I was dead or to find that I was not." She paused. "If I am not dead, Uki, the clan needs to know what to do with that fact." He thought about the single set of tracks, about the deliberateness of the approach, close enough to see the cabin clearly, far enough to avoid confrontation. "They sent a scout," he said. She nodded, "Not a warrior, a reader. Someone to assess the situation and return with information." She looked at him steadily. "They know I am here. They know I am alive. They will send someone to speak now." He absorbed this. "Let it settle. You've been waiting for this," he said. It was not an accusation. Something shifted in her face, not guilt. She had nothing to be guilty of, but a recognition that she owed him the full truth of this. "Since the first thaw," she said. "When the High Ridge Road becomes passable, I expected it. I hoped for more time." She set the cup down. "I should have told you when I first noticed the signs." He looked at her for a moment. "You were deciding what to do," he said. She held his gaze. "Yes," he nodded and picked up his cup. "Before anything else," he said, "tell me what you want to do. Not what you think you should do. Not what makes the most sense. What you want." She was quiet for a long time. The fire popped softly. Outside, a light wind had come up, moving through the pines in the low, continuous sound that was as familiar to him by now as breathing. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to stay here and have this child here and build what we have started building." She looked at him. "That is what I want." "Then that's the answer," he said. She shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in the way of someone for whom it was not yet that simple. "It is not only my answer that matters," she said. "There is a child now." He understood what she was saying. The calculus had changed. It was one thing to choose a life outside the clan for herself. She had made her peace with that before she had walked through his door. It was another to make that choice on behalf of someone who did not yet have a voice in it. He did not minimize this or move past it quickly. He sat with it the way she needed him to sit with it. Then she said, "I am going to write to my mother." He looked up. "Her name is Veda," Mara said. "She is still in the clan. She had no part in what the council decided. She was in no position to stop it." She looked at the fire. "I don't know if a letter can reach her safely. I don't know if answering would put her at risk. But I want her to know I am alive. And I want to know if she is." He knew the trader who sometimes left goods at the Crossroads Hollow 3 miles down the valley road. A taciturn man named Aldous who ran a circuit through the mountain communities twice in the spring and twice in the fall and asked no questions about the nature of the messages he carried. It was a kind of local institution. People in isolated places needed ways to speak to each other that the weather and the distance made difficult. Aldous was that way. He said, "There's a man named Aldous. I can get a letter to him next time he comes through the valley." He'll carry it wherever it needs to go. Mara nodded. She looked at him in the way she had of looking at him when she was receiving something important, fully, directly, without deflection. They wrote the letter that evening by firelight. She dictated and he wrote it in his hand because her written English was functional but not fully fluent, and they both understood that the language of the letter mattered. Clear, plain, nothing that could be misread or used against either of them. It was short. Mother, I did not die in the snow. I am warm. I am safe. I am not alone. Your daughter still breathes. No name, no location, no detail that could be traced. He folded it small and sealed it with pine resin and wrote only a name on the outside in her direction. And that name she told him in her own language, and he copied the characters carefully from her instruction. He put the letter in his coat pocket. He left it with Aldous' drop box at the Crossroads Hollow 4 days later, tucked into the split of the log beside the red-painted stone marker that meant messages left here. When he came back and told her it was on its way, she was at the table with the herbs again, hands busy, and she only nodded. But her hands were still for a moment before resuming, still in the way that meant the stillness was working on something inside her. 3 weeks passed. The snow began to concede in the places where the sun hit longest. The south face of the yard, the upper side of the woodpile. The drip from the eaves became steady in the afternoons. The creek under the ice began to make sounds again, a low murmuring, alive under there, waiting. Every afternoon, Mara went out to the porch for a while. She stood at the rail and looked south, down the valley trail that wound through the trees in the direction of the crossroads. She never stood there long, 10 minutes, sometimes 15. Then she came back inside and resumed whatever she had been doing. He saw it every day. The second evening, he came out with her coat and put it around her shoulders without comment and went back inside. After that, the coat was always on the hook by the door when she came in from the porch. He finished the cradle in the 3rd week of March. He sanded every surface smooth enough that it would not catch on the softest skin. He fitted the joints with wooden pegs, no nails, so there was nothing to work loose and no metal to go cold. He shaped the rockers from a single curved piece of ash, the hardest part of the whole thing, requiring 3 attempts before the curve was right, and fitted them to the base. When it was done, he brought it into the new room and set it in the corner where the morning light would reach it. He heard Mara in the doorway behind him. He turned. She was looking at the cradle with that expression he had been learning. He said, "The rockers might need adjusting once we see how it sits with weight in it." She said, "It's beautiful." He looked at the cradle. It was functional, well made, not beautiful in any way he would have used that word. He said, "It's pine." She crossed the room and crouched beside it and ran her fingers along the top rail. He watched her hand move along the grain, feeling the smoothness, the careful absence of anything sharp. When she stood up again, she looked at him differently than she had before. Something in the register of the amber eyes had opened, some depth that had not been there in quite that way, as though the cradle had answered a question she had been carrying too long. She pressed her lips together briefly, then opened them. "I should tell you something," she said. He waited. "My child, this child." She touched her abdomen briefly. "It is not only mine to bring into the world." She looked at him steadily. "I have not said that plainly before. I say it now." He understood what she was saying and what it cost her to say it. Not because of what she was offering him, though he understood that too, but because she had been a woman who owned almost nothing that was freely hers, and she was choosing deliberately to expand the boundaries of that ownership rather than contract them. It was the generous act of someone who had been given very little room to be generous. He said, "I know." She nodded. She went out to the main room. He stood for another moment in the room with the cradle and the morning light, and then he went out too. The visitor came on a Thursday. Colt knew it was Thursday because he kept a tally notch on the doorframe, not because the day of the week mattered much in the mountains, but because it was a habit left over from his patrol years, the need to keep account, to know where you stood in time. He had gone out early to clear the south path, which had iced over in the night, and Mara was inside beginning the bread she made twice a week now, a heavy rye loaf that she had taught herself from his stores and a fragment of a recipe she carried in her memory from childhood. He heard the footsteps on the trail before he saw the person. He set the ice axe down and turned. The orc man who came up the trail was perhaps 40, large through the shoulders, wearing a traveling cloak of heavy wool with the hood pushed back. His skin was the same deep green as Mara's, his jaw carrying two small tusks, his eyes the pale amber gray of river ice. He moved with the deliberateness of someone who has decided how this encounter is going to go and is simply executing the plan. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at Colt. "I am looking for a woman of the Stone Tusk clan," he said. His English was accented but clear. "I was told she may have found shelter in this direction." Colt said nothing. He let the silence work. "I'm not here to cause harm," the man said. "I carry a message from the council. For her ears." "You've come a long way," Colt said. "The high road is open now." The man met his eyes. "May I speak to her?" It was not quite a question. Colt looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and went to the cabin door and opened it. Mara was already at the window. She had heard the footsteps too. She looked at Colt, and he looked back at her, and then she straightened and moved to the door. She came onto the porch and stood at the top of the steps. And when the man in the yard saw her, the careful neutrality of his face shifted for just a moment. Something that was almost surprise, or almost relief, or something between the two. Then he set his expression again and spoke. "The Council of the Stone Tusk clan has authorized me to carry this offer," he said. "You are alive, and that fact must be addressed." He paused. "If you return voluntarily to the clan grounds, of your own will, presenting yourself to the council, the child you carry will be received, recognized, given a clan name and clan standing. The exile will be formally ended. You will be given a position appropriate to your return." Mara looked at him without speaking. He continued, "If you do not return, the child will have no clan recognition, no name, no standing in any Stone Tusk community. It will be born outside the clan, and it will remain outside the clan." He looked at her steadily. "That is the offer. The council understands you may need time to consider it." The yard was entirely quiet. The sound of the creek under the ice, distant and low. The light wind in the upper pines. Mara stood on the porch steps and looked at the man from her clan, with her face doing what it did when she was working through something that had layers. Still careful, the jaw very slightly set. Then she said, "How long do I have?" The man said, "The council expects an answer before the full thaw, when the valley road opens completely." She nodded once. "Go," she said. "I will send word." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled the hood of his cloak up and turned and went back down the trail the way he had come. His footsteps crunched in the ice snow and then faded, and then there was nothing. Colt stood in the doorway. Mara was still on the porch, looking at the place in the trail where the man had disappeared. Her hand had come up to rest against the railing. Her knuckles were white. He went inside and added a log to the fire. He put the kettle on. He took 2 cups from the shelf. After a long time, she came inside and closed the door and sat down in the chair closest to the hearth. She looked into the fire with the expression of someone engaged in a conversation that no one else could hear. He set a cup of hot water with honey on the floor beside her chair. Then he went to the table and picked up the draw knife handle he had been working on and took it back to his corner and began working the wood. He worked quietly and she sat, and the fire burned between them. It was perhaps an hour, perhaps longer. Then she said very quietly, "What they are offering is not nothing." He kept working the handle. He listened. "A name," she said. "Standing. A community?" She paused. "For a child, those things matter. A child without a clan is a child that the world has certain opinions about." She looked at her hands. "I know what those opinions look like from the inside." He set the draw knife down and looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the fire, but in the way of someone looking past the thing they appear to be looking at. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what makes sense for the child. What do you want?" She closed her eyes for a brief moment. "A child does not only need a name," she said. "It needs a mother who knows who she is." She was quiet for a moment. "And I stopped knowing who I was the day they walked me out of those gates. I spent 3 days in the snow trying to remember." She opened her eyes. "I think I have been remembering since I arrived here. I think I am closer to knowing than I have been in 4 years." He waited. "But I am afraid," she said. "I am afraid that what I want for myself is not the same as what is right for my child." She looked at him. "Tell me I am wrong to be afraid of that." He looked at her steadily. "You're not wrong to be afraid of it," he said. "But I think you're asking the wrong question." A child doesn't need a clan that sent its mother out to die in the winter. Whatever name they'd give it, it would come with the knowledge of what they did to you. That's part of the inheritance. He paused. A name from people who can do what they did to you is not protection. It's a debt. She was quiet for a long moment. He stood up and went to his coat on the peg by the door and reached into the inside breast pocket. His fingers found what he had placed there 3 weeks ago, after the third evening of watching her stand on the porch in the cold. He had not planned to bring it out this way. He had planned something more considered. But the moment was what it was, and the thing in his hand was what it was, and she needed something true right now more than she needed something planned. He came back across the room and set the object on the floor beside her cup. She looked down at it. It was a ring. Iron, forged rough, shaped by hand. His hand on the small anvil he kept in the woodshed for repair work. Plain, unpolished. Small imperfections in the band where the hammer had struck at slightly different angles. He had made it on a Sunday 3 weeks ago, working in the woodshed by lamplight while she slept, because something in him had needed to make a decision and had made it in the only language he was fully fluent in, which was the language of his hands. He did not say anything. He picked up the draw knife handle and went back to his corner and resumed his work. After a long time, he heard her exhale. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the last of the day's light was going from the sky. The mountains went dark in their patient order, ridge by ridge, the way they always did. He did not look up from his work. But he was aware, with the full peripheral awareness of someone who has spent 3 years learning to sense the state of the world around him without looking directly at it, that she had reached down and picked the ring up and was holding it in her closed hand. She did not put it on, not tonight, but she held it, and she did not set it back down. April came to Grayback Ridge the way it always did in the high Appalachian, not as an arrival, but as a negotiation. The snow did not surrender. It retreated by degrees, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, then the yard, then the woodshed roof, leaving behind dark earth that steamed faintly in the midday sun before freezing again each night. The creek broke its ice in the second week and ran clear and loud, filling the mornings with a sound that felt, after the long silence of winter, almost extravagant. Green appeared in the spaces the snow left behind, pale and tentative at first, then with growing conviction, the way courage comes back after a long time without it. Mara did not give the council's man an answer. Not in the first week after his visit, and not in the second. The deadline he had named, before the full thaw, before the valley road opened, hung in the air of the cabin like weather, present without being spoken of. The way serious things sometimes are between people who have learned to trust the other's ability to carry their own weight. She did not put the iron ring on. She did not set it aside either. He saw it on the third morning where he had placed it on the floor beside her chair, on the small shelf above her bed in the new room, set in the groove between two boards where it would not roll. He saw it there and said nothing. It was hers to do with as she decided, and the decision was not yet made, and he had learned enough about her by now to know that she would make it completely when she made it, and that forcing the pace would only make the ground less solid under whatever she built on it. He went about the work of the changing season. There was always more work in the early spring than in the deep winter. The winter was survival, a matter of maintaining what existed. The spring was reconstruction, reassessment, the cabin and yard and woodshed and tools all presenting themselves after the long months of cold with their accumulated needs. He patched the south wall where a seam had opened slightly in the freeze. He rehung the woodshed door, which had warped along one edge and no longer closed flush. He walked the trap line and pulled the winter snares and began thinking about the summer ones. He cleared the path to the creek and widened it, thinking without exactly deciding to that a wider path would be easier when Mara's belly had grown heavier and her balance had shifted. She saw him doing this and understood why. The next morning she was out before him, pulling the last of the debris from the path with her own hands, moving methodically, unhurried, the way she did everything now, as if the work was not separate from her, but an expression of something she was working out internally through the movement of her body. He watched her from the porch with a cup of coffee and let her work. This was how the days passed. Side by side, not always speaking, the silence between them, the comfortable kind that requires a long time to build and can't be manufactured. They ate together in the evenings and sat by the fire afterward. And sometimes she talked, and sometimes he did, and sometimes neither did. And all three of those things were equally ordinary and equally fine. But underneath the ordinary surface of the days, she was thinking. He could feel it the way you feel weather coming before the sky has changed. A slight difference in the quality of the air around her. A focused inward quality when she thought he wasn't watching. She was turning something over and over in her mind the way water turns a stone, patient and continuous, wearing it toward the shape it needed to be. He did not try to reach into that process. He had learned in his own years of carrying things that required time that the most useful thing another person can do is simply remain present without making their presence into a demand. He remained present. He did the work. He kept the fire. One morning in the third week of April, she did not come out for breakfast at the usual time. He had the oats on and the coffee made, and he waited. He was not concerned. She sometimes slept later now, the pregnancy pulling on her in ways she didn't fully acknowledge but that he could see in the slight heaviness of her movement at the end of a long day. He waited 15 minutes and then went quietly to the door of the new room and listened. He heard her inside, moving slowly, the sound of her sitting on the bed. The sound of her breathing, not distress exactly, but something concentrated, like attention turned entirely inward. He went back to the fire and took the oats off the heat. When she came out 10 minutes later, she was dressed and her hair was braided, and her face had the look of someone who has arrived somewhere after a long walk. She sat down at the table. He put the oats in front of her and sat across. She ate in silence for a while. He drank his coffee. The fire behind him was warm and steady. He did not rush the moment. He had learned not to. Then she said, "I have been thinking about what they are offering." He set the cup down. She looked at the table, not at him. She spoke in the careful, measured way that meant she was giving him the finished version of something she had been working through for a long time. "A name from the Stone-Tusked clan," she said. "That is what they are offering this child. A name from a council that deliberated for less than an afternoon before deciding to send a woman out to die in the worst winter in 6 years." She paused. "A name from a chieftain who stood in a hall in front of every man and woman and child of his clan and let them call me cursed and barren and broken, because naming me those things was easier than speaking the truth about himself." She looked up. "I have been asking myself whether my child deserves better than that name," she said. "And I have been asking myself what better looks like." She was quiet for a moment. "What I keep returning to is this. A name is not protection. It is not love. It is not food or warmth or the knowledge that the people around you will stay when things become difficult. It is a word attached to a history, and the history this particular name comes attached to is the history of what they did to me." She pushed the oats aside and put both hands flat on the table. "I am not going back," she said. She said it the way she said things that were fully decided, without drama, without the slight upward inflection of something still seeking confirmation. It was a statement in the way a stone wall is a statement, complete, settled, bearing weight. He nodded once. She looked at him. There was something in her face that was lighter than it had been. Not relief, something more permanent than relief. Resolution, maybe. The face of someone who has stopped fighting a current and found solid ground underfoot. "I am not going back," she said again, and this time it sounded slightly different, as if she were testing the sound of it in the open air, listening to how it fell. "I am staying here. This child will be born in that room, in that bed, in this cabin. It will learn to walk in this yard. It will hear this creek and know these mountains, and it will not have a clan name from people who sent its mother out to die." She paused. "It will have what we make for it instead." He said, "That's enough." She looked at him. "What we make for it is enough," he said, "more than enough." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, and the nod had finality in it, the kind that closes a door that has been open too long. They finished breakfast without speaking, and then they went outside and did the work of the day. That afternoon, he wrote out the message they would send to the trader's drop at the crossroads, a single line, unsigned, in the neutral language of a business communication concluded. "The matter you brought to our attention has been considered. The answer is no." He sealed it with pine resin as he had sealed the letter to Veda, and folded it small, and put it in his coat pocket to carry to the hollow the next morning. He was pulling on his coat when she came in from the new room holding something. He turned. She was standing in the doorway between the two rooms, and in her hands she held a small piece of cloth, dark red, almost the color of dried blood, folded neatly into a square no bigger than his palm. She was looking at it with an expression he could not read at first, then could. She was crying, not dramatically. The tears were running quietly down her green cheeks, one and then another, and her face was entirely calm despite them, the way the surface of deep water is calm in the rain. He crossed the room. She held the cloth out to him. He took it and turned it over in his hands. It was good cloth, not rough trade fabric, but something fine, tightly woven, with a small pattern of repeating geometry along one edge that he recognized as Stone Tusk clan marking. It had been folded with deliberate precision. He looked up at her. "From the porch," she said, "this morning, when I went out before breakfast." He understood now what she had found when she opened her door. What had kept her in the new room for those 15 minutes? She said, "It is my mother's cloth. I know it by the weave. She used this pattern for everything she made. Blankets, wrapping cloth, the sashes she wore for ceremony." She looked at the square of fabric in his hands. "She made this piece of cloth, and she folded it exactly this way, and she left it where I would find it." He held the cloth out and she took it back, holding it in both hands. "She received the letter," Mara said. Her voice was steady but very quiet. "She received it and she found a way to answer. She is inside the clan, without resources, without power to act openly. She could not write back through a traitor. She could not send a messenger with words. But she found a way." She paused. She always found a way. He stood quietly in front of her. "She told me she knew," Mara said. "She told me she was glad. She told me she loves me." She looked up. She didn't use any of those words. She used this piece of cloth. "But that is what it says." He stood quietly in front of her. She pressed the cloth against her chest and closed her eyes for a moment, and the tears kept coming quietly, and her face was not the face of grief. It was the face of someone receiving something they had stopped expecting to receive, something they thought the world had taken permanently, finding out that the world had only misplaced it. After a moment, she opened her eyes and looked at him. She said, "I have not cried since before they opened the gates." He said, "I know." She nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a single, unselfconscious movement, and then she looked at the cloth again and folded it carefully along its original lines. He said, "We should hang it somewhere you can see it." She looked at him. "By the window," he said, "in the new room. The morning light will hit it first thing." She looked at the cloth in her hands, then at him, and something in the amber of her eyes shifted. Something opened that had been carefully managed for a very long time. "Yes," she said. He found a small finishing nail and drove it gently into the wall beside the eastern window of the new room, and she hung the folded cloth there on its corner, where the morning light would find it first. They stood and looked at it together for a moment, the dark red cloth against the pale pine wall, simple and exact. Then she said, "Come outside with me." He followed her out to the porch. The afternoon had gone golden in the way that April afternoons in the mountains sometimes do unexpectedly. The light coming in at a low angle through the new leaves on the birches at the edge of the yard, turning everything briefly the color of old honey. The air was mild, not warm, not yet, not at this elevation, but the edge had left it, the cutting quality of winter air that had been present every day since November, gone now, replaced by something that simply felt like air again. She stood at the porch rail and looked out at the yard and the tree line and the sky above the ridge. He stood beside her. She had one hand resting on the curve of her belly, which had grown in the last few weeks into something undeniable. Not large yet, but present, the body asserting itself in a way that no longer permitted ambiguity. She rested her hand there without thinking about it now. It had become simply where her hand went. After a while, she said quietly, "I want you to ask me something." He looked at her. She continued looking at the yard. Her profile in the afternoon light was composed and deliberate. The strong line of jaw, the amber eye, the hair past her shoulders now, the ends slightly uneven where she had cut them herself weeks ago. "I want you to ask me to be your wife," she said. Her voice was even and clear. "Not because of this child, not because I have no place to go, not because it makes sense or because it is practical, Or because the world will be easier if there is a word for what I am to you? She paused. Ask me because you choose me, the same way I chose you. Standing at the edge of the trees in the snow, watching you move when you thought no one was watching, making the calculation, making the decision. She turned and looked at him directly. Ask me the way I chose you, deliberately, knowing what you're choosing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, wait here. He went inside. He crossed to the coat peg and reached into the inside breast pocket and found only the folded message for the traitor. He stood for one disoriented second before he remembered. She had it. She had been keeping it on the shelf above her bed. He went to the door of the new room and it was there in its groove between the boards. The plain iron band he had made on a Sunday 3 weeks ago on the small anvil in the woodshed by lamplight, rough and unpolished and shaped entirely by his own hands. He picked it up. He went back outside. She was still at the rail facing out. She heard him come through the door and turned. He came down the porch steps and stood in front of her. He did not think about ceremony or custom. He had no custom that applied here, and her custom had been used against her by people who did not deserve to invoke it. He stood in front of her on the porch steps in the April light and looked at her face and spoke plainly. Mara Stonetusk, he said, will you be my wife? Not by the laws of any clan, not because the world expects it, not because of the child, though I am glad of the child, and I will be glad of it every day. He held her gaze. Because I have watched you walk back from the worst thing that was ever done to you, and I have never in my life seen anyone move with more dignity than you have moved through these last months in this cabin. Because you chose me when you had nothing left to lose, and somehow that choice was still entirely yours, made entirely freely. Because every day I find out something new about who you are, and every day it is more than what I thought the day before. He paused. And because I want to wake up beside you tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that the mountain gives us. He held up the ring. Will you stay with me? Not as someone I saved, as my equal, my partner, my wife. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright, the amber deep and clear, and she was not crying now, though she had been an hour ago. She was entirely present, entirely herself, looking at him with the full, focused attention of someone receiving something they have calculated the worth of and found it accurate. She reached out and took the ring from his hand. She looked at it, the plain band, the imperfections in the iron where the hammer had struck unevenly, the slightly rough inner surface that she would feel against her finger every day. She turned it once in her fingers. Then she said, yes. She said it the way she said everything fully decided, simply, completely, without qualification. She slid the ring onto the fourth finger of her left hand and held her hand out for a moment and looked at it there. The iron was dark against the green of her skin, plain and permanent. She lowered her hand and looked at him. Before he could speak, she put her hand against his jaw and kissed him. Unhurried in the afternoon light, with the sound of the creek carrying up from the trees below and the birches moving slightly in the easy air. It was not a kiss of gratitude or relief. It was the kiss of a person who has chosen something clearly and is confirming the choice with their whole body. When they drew apart, she kept her forehead against his and breathed. I choose you, Colt Hargrove, she said. Her voice was low and certain. Today and every day after. He put his arms around her, careful, the way he had learned to be careful with her, not out of fragility, but out of respect for the fact that she had been handled carelessly before, and carefulness was a form of statement. She leaned into him and he held her, and the afternoon light lay across the porch and the yard in long gold bars, and the mountain held everything in its enormous patient stillness. Then she made a sound, a bomb, not quite a laugh and not quite a kid, but something between the two, sudden and unguarded. She drew back slightly and looked down, one hand going to the side of her belly. She took his hand and placed it there, pressing it firmly against the curve. He felt it. A movement under his palm, definite, strong, a push outward and then gone and then back again. Not a flutter, a deliberate, muscular assertion, the unmistakable communication of something that already had opinions about the world it was preparing to enter. He kept his hand there. The child moved again, once, strong and then still. He looked up at her. She was watching his face with an expression he would carry for the rest of his life. Not joy exactly, though joy was part of it, something larger and quieter than joy. The expression of a person standing in a place they did not believe they would reach when the journey began, looking around at the view and finding it more than they had any right to expect. That one has always known what it wanted, she said. He laughed. It came out of him without planning. A real laugh, the kind that lives in the chest and does not ask permission. He could not remember the last time he had laughed that way. She smiled at him fully, all the way to the amber eyes. They stood on the porch together as the gold left the air, and the sky over the ridge went to rose and then to the clear pale blue of a spring evening at elevation. The pines on the ridge went dark in sequence, one stand and then the next, the mountains doing what they always did, withdrawing into themselves at the end of the day, patient and enormous, entirely indifferent to human event, which was somehow comforting rather than diminishing. The world was large and old, and it did not require anything of them except to live in it honestly. He built a fire high that evening. They ate together at the table, the good meal he had been planning in the back of his mind for 2 days without admitting he was planning it, the venison he had been saving, the dried apples reconstituted in water with a little honey, the last of the cornmeal made into a thick flatbread on the hearthstone. She ate with appetite, which she always did now, the pregnancy having resolved her early indifference to food into something closer to enthusiasm. She broke a second piece of flatbread without asking if there was enough, and he was quietly glad to see it. After he washed the dishes and she sat by the fire with the piece of cloth from Veda in her lap, not doing anything with it, just holding it the way you hold something you are not ready to put down yet. He dried his hands and came and sat in the chair beside her. After a while, she said, "She would like you." He looked at her. "Veda," she said, "my mother." She looked at the cloth. She is not a woman who gives her approval quickly. She watches. She listens more than she speaks. She has a look she gives people she doesn't trust, and a different one for people she does, and most people never see the second one. She paused. But she would see you. She would watch you the way I watched you from the trees, and she would come to the same conclusion. "How do you know?" he said. "Because I am her daughter," she said, "and because I came to that conclusion." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe she'll come one day," he said, "when it's safe enough." Mara looked at him, and her voice was careful with the word, handling the hope in it gently. "Maybe," she said, "one day." She folded the cloth along its lines and held it a moment more. Then she rose and went to the new room and came back without it. She had hung it back on the nail beside the window, where the morning light would find it. She stood in the doorway between the two rooms and looked back at him. The ring caught the firelight from where it sat on her finger, the plain iron band, dark and unornamented, holding the warmth of the flames in its rough surface. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For the room," she said, "for the letter, for the fire, for all the mornings you put the coat on the hook so I could find it there." She paused. "For not making me smaller than I am." He said, "You were never small." She nodded once slowly, as if placing that somewhere she would be able to find it later. Then she went into the new room. He heard the sound of her settling onto the bed. After a few minutes her lamp went out, and the line of light under the door disappeared, and there was only the hearth. He banked the fire for the night, laying the coals carefully so they would hold until morning. He checked the door brace. He stood for a moment in the warm quiet of the main room, looking at the stone hearth and the rough walls with their pegs and shelves and the small window where the April dark outside was full of stars. Through the wall he could hear her breathing, slow and deep and entirely at rest, the breathing of someone who has put down something heavy and found the ground solid under their feet. He went to his bed. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling he had built with his own hands 3 years ago, and listened to the creek running full and clear over its stones, and to the sound of her breathing through the wall, and to the fire settling in the other room. He had come to these mountains to disappear. He had built this cabin with the hands of a man trying to make himself small enough that the world could not find anything left worth taking. He had succeeded at that. The world had mostly left him alone, and then a woman had stood at the edge of the trees in the snow and spent a day watching him before she decided he was worth the risk of asking for help. She had made that calculation, alone in the worst conditions, with nothing left to lose, and she had gotten it right. He thought about what it took to still be able to do that, To still be able to look at a stranger and read him accurately after everything her clan had done to her. How much of herself she must have kept intact in some protected place inside through the 4 years of the chieftain's hall and the council's judgment and the exile into the killing cold. She had walked out of those gates stripped of everything they could steal from her, and she had arrived at his door with that capacity still working, still choosing, still deciding. He was still turning this over when sleep found him, quiet and complete, the way sleep comes when the body has finally stopped waiting for the thing it was afraid of. Outside, the creek ran loud over its stones. The pines on the ridge moved in the light air coming down off the mountain. The stars above Grayback Ridge were the stars of an April night at elevation, close and numerous. The kind of sky that makes a man feel the size of the world without making him feel small in it. In the new room beside the eastern window, the red cloth from Veda hung on its nail in the dark. Patient, waiting for the morning light that would find it first, exactly as he had promised it would. In the corner of the same room, the pine cradle sat on its ash rockers, every surface smooth, every joint tight, every edge sanded to something that could not catch or cut or harm. Empty now, not for much longer. And in the morning, in the early light that would come first through the eastern window and fall first on the red cloth and then spread across the room and into the main room where the fire would be burning again, the same fire that had not gone out since November. In that morning, they would wake, separately and then together, and begin the work of the day. Not because the world had arranged itself kindly, it had not. Not because things had gone as either of them had planned. They had not planned for any of this. But because two people had looked at each other clearly in the middle of the worst winters of their separate lives and decided to stay. That decision, made once in the snow and then again at the fire and then again on the porch in the April light, was the foundation. Everything else, the room, the cradle, the ring, the red cloth on the wall, the child that kicked with opinions already formed. Everything else was what you built on a foundation that held. The spring was just beginning, and in the cabin at the foot of Grayback Ridge, something was growing. The way all lasting things grow, quietly, in the dark, putting down roots before it shows above the surface. Patient and deliberate and very, very difficult to stop. Outside, the mountain breathed. The creek ran. The stars turned in their ancient order across the Appalachian sky. Tomorrow the work would begin again. There was always more work. There always would be. And that too was everything.